Welcome to Traces of a Jewish Artist, the lost life and work of Rahel Szalit. In our series Flight or Fight, Stories of Artists Under Repression. A woman author presenting a woman artist. Is there a better start of Women History Month? I'm Rachel Stern, Executive Director of the Fritz Ascher Society for Persecuted, Ostracized, and Banned Art based in New York. Today, I'm honored to introduce Kerry Wallach, who is Associate Professor and Chair of German Studies and an affiliate of the Jewish Studies program at Gettysburg College. She's the author of Traces of a Jewish Artist, The Lost Life and Work of Rahel Szalit, Penn State University Press, 2024, and Passing Illusions, Jewish Visibility in Weimar Germany, 2017, and co-editor with Aya El-Yada of German Jewish Studies, Next Generations. She's also a co-editor of German Jewish Cultures, a book series published by Indiana University Press. Her book about Rahel Szalit can now be pre-ordered. After the presentation, there will be time for Q&A, so please post your questions. Thank you. Welcome, Kerry Wallach.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for this kind invitation. I'm so happy to be here today, and I'm so excited to share my new book project with everyone, and also to introduce you to a forgotten artist, someone who you may not be familiar with. Much of Rahel Szalit's life was about the search for freedom and artistic freedom, freedom from persecution, and I think she aligns really well with the projects of the Fritz Ascher Society, so I'm really happy to be able to introduce her in this context. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so you can see some images today. How's that look?
Perfect.
Okay, wonderful. Rahel Szalit was a prominent Jewish artist in Weimar Germany before the Nazis came to power. She was Jewish both in terms of her background and upbringing, and also she made art with Jewish subjects. She first made a name for herself as an illustrator, and the majority of her works that have survived are lithographic prints that appeared in both books and print portfolios. One critic at the time called her quite simply the best modern female illustrator, or the first female illustrator of Jewish literature. And so she also worked in pen and ink, pencil, pastel, chalk, oil paint, and watercolors, and women figured prominently in many of her works. She often centered women by emphasizing the role of female characters in the work she illustrated, as you can see here in these two images, illustrating Tillier and Heine. So today there's only one known photograph of Rahel Szalit, though we have several self-portraits that she did. And you can see also that her name and her identity and her signature evolved over time. Most of her work from before 1924 is signed Rahel Szalit-Marcus. Marcus is her maiden name. And beginning in 1924, she signed Rahel Szalit or R. Szalit, and occasionally RSZ period. And some of those names you can see actually take her gender out of the equation. From Rahel Szalit's story, we learn how exceptional women artists gained access to both mainstream art movements and the Jewish Renaissance by engaging with different media and genres. So Szalit was very resourceful. She followed cultural trends to meet artistic demands of the moment, from printmaking to portraiture. She sort of went with the flow and was very versatile in that way. But she's largely been neglected in history and in art history because many of her works were destroyed or went missing after she was arrested in 1942. I first discovered her in the Jewish press, but couldn't find much information about her. So part of my search for more information led to this book and led to this project. And I worked for about 15 years to recover everything I could find about her, consulted over 35 archives in 7 countries, and I've put together a narrative that still has plenty of different gaps. It's not a complete narrative by any means, but it's a story that we can tell and that we can use to sort of get a fuller picture of her life and her work. And the art, of course, also tells its own story. So in my book, I divide Szalit's life into 4 parts, and I'll divide my talk today into 4 parts as well. In the first part, I'm looking at how she came from Eastern Europe to Central Europe, so from the shtetl to the city. In the second part, I'm looking at her illustrations that were largely created in the early 1920s under inflation. The third part looks at the wild sides of Weimar, the late 1920s and early 1930s. And then the fourth part is when she lived in exile in Paris after 1933. And I also wanted you to be able to see at the beginning a sort of overview of where she lived geographically to try to understand her story. So she was born in 1980, excuse me, she was born in 1888 in the shtetl of Tels, also called Telshai, in the Russian Empire. Today, that's Lithuania. It was a small town with a large Yiddish-speaking Jewish community. Rahel Marcus's father was a brush maker, a Bershtar. His livelihood kept the family afloat. When she was young, the family moved to the industrial city of Łódź in Poland, the Polish Manchester, which at that time was still part of the Russian Empire. And there she learned Polish, German, and French. And she wanted to study art, but the best place to study art at that time, in her view, was Munich. And she followed several other artists from Łódź in moving on to Munich to pursue art studies. From there, she also made short trips to London and Paris that she always mentioned as part of her biography. But as far as we know, the records don't reflect that she was ever officially enrolled in any of these art academies there. But she did manage to obtain training. In 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War, she was considered an enemy alien. She was forced to leave Germany. And she spent some time after that in Vienna. In 1916, due to a change in her citizenship status that came with her marriage, she was able to return to Germany, and she moved to Berlin, which is where she lived from 1916 until about 1933. We don't know exactly when she left Germany, but 1933 is the safest bet, when she was forced to leave Germany for a second time and flee to France, to Paris. So the fact that she lived in all these different places and had all of these different connections to different communities helps us understand how complicated her relationship was to citizenship and also to belonging. Her own nationality is complicated. She was born in the Russian Empire, briefly had Austrian citizenship, later had Polish citizenship. And this also really complicates the way she's remembered and categorized, including by art historians. So in the first part, what you're looking at here are some images that Szalit created of shtetl or small town Jewish life that reflect her life in Eastern Europe. She unquestionably thought of herself as a Jewish artist. In a 1930 survey, she wrote, "I am comfortable as a Jewish woman. I love my people. I am an Eastern Jewish woman." She used the word Ostjuden, "and I feel closest to Eastern Jews." Elsewhere, she referred to the Jewish milieu of my little Jewish Lithuanian town and the poor and poorest of my Lithuanian home, suggesting that her early years inspired her Jewish art the most. Szalit's perspective as an Eastern Jewish insider, not an outside observer, put her in the rare position of being able to relay and visually translate these experiences without promoting them as idyllic. And here you can see just some of these interesting scenes and moments that she recreated, thinking back to her Lithuanian childhood. We see an annual fair, men with a horse sort of going to see a rabbi. That was reprinted in the Yiddish magazine Milgräum in Berlin in 1922. And we also see a photograph of a lost painting titled Jewish Neighborhood that appeared in an American magazine. So even while looking at her artwork, we don't always have the originals. We don't always have access to the originals. We're often looking at reproductions in different magazines and newspapers. In this image, which is one of the few known surviving paintings that Szalit did, we're able to interpret her use of color a little bit more. In this, The Town Musicians was created in an expressionist style and recalls works by painters like Marc Chagall and Manet Katz, who are showing us folkloric motifs and in Szalit's case, with a real sense of melancholy. We see these two-story houses with slanted roofs, sort of reminiscent of many different scenes that we see in German Expressionist imagery. We also see these quirky inhabitants. In this case, we have musicians with sallow green faces, really creating and reproducing a sense of Eastern authenticity. In 1910, Rahel Szalit moved from Eastern Europe to Munich. And here you see a couple of different documents that provide information about Szalit's life. One question that has arisen many times is why there are so many different birth years for her listed in many different places. For a long time, we didn't have her original birth record. We only had different documents that gave her birth year as listed it, and you can see it's even listed differently here as well. Her birth record is from 1888 from the Lithuanian Jewish community records. But even just a few years later, Szalit was already listing her own birth date as 1892. So the documents themselves conflict at times, but the original birth record is from 1888, and that's in Russian and Hebrew at the top there. The Munich registration cards are interesting, partly because you can see right here, they declare her home community as Łódź. So she wasn't actually from Łódź in Poland, but that's where she had come from before she came to Munich. So that was listed as her home community at that time. These are a couple of the documents we have now, but it's also really worth noting that there's so many other documents and pieces of evidence in her story that we don't have, that we may never have. The Berlin records, for example, all of the Berlin registration cards destroyed, not available, lost in the war. We simply don't have evidence and confirmation of lots of different details about her life that we might otherwise have access to. I wanted to take at least one slide and focus on her relationship with Julius Szalit, to whom she was married for several years. Julius Szalit was an actor whom she met in Munich. He was originally from Tarnopol in Eastern Galicia, which was then Austria-Hungary. Today it's in Ukraine. His family had connections to Krakow and Vienna. He also knew Polish and German. And Rahel went with Julius to Austria after she had to leave Germany in 1914. He was involved in some acting projects there. And they got married in the Vienna Jewish community in 1915, as the marriage record here shows. And then both of them went together to Berlin in 1916. And they remained married until his death by suicide in 1919. But we have some pretty strong evidence that they were most likely separated or estranged for an amount of time before his death. So it's a very interesting relationship. We can speculate about it. We don't have any of their correspondence, but they had a marriage that at least changed her circumstances for several years. So I'm moving into the second part of my talk now, where I want to talk about Rahel Szalit's time in Berlin. And here you can see she lived in Berlin-Schöneberg for over a decade at Stubbenstraße number 3, just around the corner from Bayerischer Platz in the Bavarian quarter of Schöneberg. Many Jews lived in this neighborhood at this time. And the original building where she lived still stands. You can see it in the middle here, Stubbenstraße number 3. We know she lived on the 5th floor. We don't know exactly which apartment, but you can see she might have lived. The second image on the right shows the sort of back courtyard view of this building. She might have lived overlooking a quiet courtyard. And in fact, she painted some interiors that also show sort of looking out the window of a courtyard. So perhaps those were painted at home. Her career gained momentum in Berlin. She first started exhibiting around 1920. She took up fencing in Berlin and gave lessons in drawing, painting, and fencing just in order to make ends meet and to augment her inconsistent artist's income. And you can see here also a small advertisement that appeared in a Jewish newspaper for her painting and drawing lessons toward the end of the 1920s. She spent time at the Romanisches Café in Berlin. She could walk there from her apartment in under 30 minutes. It was a gathering spot for artists and intellectuals, including many from Eastern Europe. Perhaps it was here that she encountered artists such as Ludwig Meidner and Jakob Steinhardt, whom she knew and she attended gatherings in their homes, and she got to know many different circles of artists while she was living in Berlin at this time. But of course, the first years in the immediate years after World War I were very difficult for everyone. They were years that saw the influenza epidemic, food shortages, hunger, cold, and also inflation. These were very difficult times for everyone. And we see this reflected in Szalit's art from this period. We see her sort of engaging with the city. In this image on the left, you see Leipziger Platz. This is a photograph of a lost painting of a part of town. You can sort of see different modes of transportation entering the city around this time. But we also see in the painting in the middle, in der Kälte, in the cold, which was painted prior to being reprinted in 1920 in a Jewish newspaper, we see a hunched old woman shivering in a cloak next to a building. She's reflected in its surface. We sort of can feel some of the difficulties that people were experiencing at this time. And on the right, we see a part of a cartoon that Szalit drew. There was also a caption that went with it. And here we see a woman who lost her job, was laid off from her job. The inflation period is key to understanding Szalit's illustrations from this period. So we could spend a full hour or more just talking about Szalit's illustrations from the early 1920s. I'm definitely not going to do that. But I am going to look at a few key examples from her illustrations of Jewish and world literature and hopefully give you a sense of some of the work she was doing at this time. Most of her illustrations from this period were lithographic prints. Prints and portfolios, print portfolios, were in demand because they offered a form of stable currency. Artwork in general offered a form of stable currency when the German mark became increasingly worthless in 1922 and 1923. So it was a time when people could invest in something that would hold its value even as the mark became devalued. At this time, also foreign publishers came to Germany to take advantage of the low costs for those who had foreign currency. So this is why several of her portfolios and books that she illustrated were published in Yiddish and Hebrew, as well as in German at this time. So many of those were foreign publishers who came to Germany, largely because of the inflation circumstances. So we have 3 existing portfolios of her prints. She illustrated Sholem Aleichem's Model the Cantor's Son, Mendele Mocher Svorim's or Abramovich's Fishka the Lame, and Heinrich Heine's Hebrew Melodies. And you can see an image here as well in the upper right from the children's book by Chaim Nachman Bialik that she contributed illustrations to. That book had several illustrators. And several illustrations that she did for Zangwill's King of the Schnorrers, the original drawings, actually just resurfaced last year at auction. But those are the original sort of graphite drawings and not lithographic reproductions. So we know that she did work with other materials at this time. And some of them are still coming to light. So even some of her lost work is still out there waiting to be found, perhaps. Especially Szalit's drawings of Yiddish literature use a form of grotesque humor. One critic at the time described them as outwardly grotesque, but inwardly moving. And he wrote that Szalit created visions of ghettos where grimaces distort faces, but not souls. In trying to understand her work, we can also look to a phrase that Szalit used that was often associated with Sholem Aleichem as well. And the phrase is laughter through tears. She saw her sense of humor that she was using to depict these grotesque figures. Sometimes she saw it as a form of self-preservation. She was telling a long history of affliction while pointing out the comical or absurd nature of individual moments. And this description particularly applies to Yiddish literature. So here you can see, for example, an image called A Street Sneezes, which is from her portfolio illustrating Model the Cantor's Son. And in some of these images, pain, discomfort, extreme poverty, misfortune, and even disability become sites for envisioning the Eastern Jewish experience. Szalit is telling us the story of suffering and resilience, but she's doing it in images that walk the line between humor and caricature. At times, she's reproducing stereotypes. Her exaggerated or grotesque features make Jewishness legible in some cases. And this image of sneezing figures illustrates a scheme to drive away rats. Model burst open a sack of fake rat poison in the story, and that was actually sneezing powder. So Szalit shows us an image of 4 people sneezing simultaneously. She depicts them in mid-sneeze. We see animalistic howls on their faces. Their faces are contorted, their bodies are stooped, bent, and out of control, all against this backdrop with the angular pointed roofs. In Szalit's illustrations of world literature, we have many different examples to draw from. She illustrated Russian literature in German translation, so Dostoevsky's The Crocodile and Tolstoy's The Kreutzer Sonata. She also illustrated French and English literature that was translated into German, so Tillier's My Uncle Benjamin and Dickens, several stories by Charles Dickens that were put into a volume called Images of London, Londoner Bilder. And many of these images, as you can see, focus on female characters or put women's experiences front and center. I also wanted to point out, and this is something we can talk about more in the Q&A, but I wanted to just show the first edition, the edition that Szalit illustrated of Dickens's Londoner Bilder, in Images of London, which was published in the spring of 1923, at a time when hyperinflation was approaching its peak in the fall of that year. And this volume, I think, is a particularly good example of one that was meant as a collector's item or edition. It was a particularly valuable object. It was made with goatskin leather, gilded. The first 100 copies looked like this, and had thick handmade paper with rough edges, 16 images total by Szalit, including 10 quarter page and 6 full page illustrations. So not all of the books are quite that fancy, quite that nice, but that's a particular example of an object that was meant for people to be able to purchase at a time when they needed something to hold on to. One image that I wanted to talk about in depth is one of my personal favorites, is this image that illustrates Tolstoy's The Kreutzer Sonata. It's an image of a wife anticipating her murder. The reason why I think this image is particularly instructive for us is because in Tolstoy's story, it's told from the perspective of the main character, who narrates in the first person how he flew into a jealous rage and murdered his wife. That's the story. It's a little bit upsetting. Szalit reframes it. She flips the script for us. She tells us the story from the perspective of the wife. We don't see the murderer approaching. We don't see the murder weapon. We see and we experience the feelings of the person who's anticipating this murder. So I think this is a particularly powerful image, and it also shows you how her illustrations of world literature look quite different, and in some cases from her illustrations of Jewish literature. In this case, less exaggerated, less grotesque, although we still see some exaggerated facial features. During her time in Berlin, Szalit had 2 major solo exhibitions. The first was at the Gutenberg bookstore in Berlin, which was near the Kurfürstendamm, featured scenes from Jewish small town life. And the second was at Zingler's Kabinett in Frankfurt, which was a prestigious gallery. This exhibition marked a turning point in her career when she became known for media other than lithographs and illustrations, and her small, colorful landscapes and her artistically strong, highly expressive portrait drawings received attention in write-ups of this exhibition. And here you can see some of the portraits that she drew, and most of these appeared in newspapers, so they were sort of intended for that genre. And it also shows how she sort of entered the newspaper journalism publication world at this time. She had a series that appeared in the Berliner Börsenkurier newspaper. And she knew Herbert Ehring personally. You can see him on the left, a theater critic who wrote for this paper. And she corresponded with him. I sort of translate one of their letters in my book. So we know that she was connected personally to some of her portrait subjects. I don't know if she met all of her portrait subjects or if she was perhaps drawing from photographs or met them only briefly, I couldn't say, but we know that she knew some of them, and she was really plugged into this Berlin world by the mid-1920s. And so here we enter the third part of the talk, where we're talking about the wild sides of Weimar. Szalit's really moving away from book illustrations and toward newspapers. In some of her book illustrations from Dostoevsky appear here at the bottom on the right, but we also see some of the images of animals that she contributed to periodicals. So she often drew images of animals, but she also was involved in thinking about the Berlin Zoo as a site of interest to people living in Berlin. And she used animals as a basis for commenting on relationships between people. And here you can see a full-page cartoon of hers that appeared in a magazine that was a supplement to the Berliner Tageblatt newspaper. We can assume that Szalit wrote her own captions, that she'd become sort of a full-fledged cartoonist by this time on some level. And I've enlarged one of these images for you here on the right. We see an artist who's sketching animals in this image. And then sitting in the foreground of the image is a fur-clad woman who says, "So what if he draws animals? I'm as beautiful and as wild as them every day." So in these images, we see people and animals existing harmoniously, but all of them are on display for each other. All of them are being looked at and watched in the public space of the Berlin Zoo. And I'd just like to point out that many of Szalit's images have chickens or roosters appearing in the image, so don't miss the chickens in several of these images. Szalit's images that appeared in Jewish periodicals were served different purposes. The one on the top here is an example of an image that appeared above vacation advertisements in the Zionist newspaper, the Jüdische Rundschau. We also see scenes of traditional holiday observance: Purim, Passover, Yom Kippur, Hanukkah. On the right, also an image of children eating breakfast that appeared in a Jewish magazine. And we can see in all of these images, well, in some of them, she's illustrating stories. Others serve, like the one on the left, as a part of the newspaper, calling for Purim donations to the newspaper's campaign. So it's interesting to think about the function of some of these images, perhaps even serving advertising purposes. Szalit also wrote several of her own stories about Jewish holidays, and here you can see how her stories appeared when they appeared in print in the magazine, in the newspaper Jüdische Rundschau. You can also see how her illustrations complement the text. It's interesting to think about whether she wrote the text first or did the illustrations first. I would guess she wrote the text first. And she wrote these stories in German. In my book, I've translated them into English. If anyone is interested in reading them in English translation, they're particularly fun, and they give us the sense of small town life in Eastern Europe. One of my favorite characters in these stories is the story of Gitta. You can see her sort of in the center on the right, illustrating the Passover story. Gitta is someone who bakes her own matzah and sells it. She has a business trying to feed her many children, baking matzah in her home and selling it around Passover time. And at one point, the mayor shuts down her operation and says she doesn't have a permit to run matzah baking out of her home. And she goes to negotiate with the mayor, and she says, "You are the master of the city. I am the master of my oven." She's this sort of strong female character advocating for her family's best interests, and is able to continue baking matzah despite challenges. And it's also worth noting here, you don't want to miss the drunk chickens in the image called The Drunk Chickens on the Passover story on the right here, where we see some chickens who have gotten into some mead wine and are causing quite a stir in the home. So many of Szalit's works from the late 1920s focused on women. She depicted a wide range of experiences, from more traditional roles to experiences of parties and nightlife. Some of her works were in line with the more realistic art movement, the New Objectivity. She had an emphasis on portraits. Some of her images depict the new woman, someone who, like Szalit, had a career, was very athletic, did sports, and also took a modern and free approach to gender and sexuality. And here I would just comment that the watercolor painting at the bottom here that shows a drive to the wedding was one that was reproduced on postcards and also in art books, was one of Szalit's better known works, and is also an example that we still have of a watercolor painting that she did. So we also know that Szalit participated in Berlin's queer circles, and this is one of the more interesting finds that I made in my research. Here you see several drawings that illustrate Thomas Mann's story Dina, which was included in his novel, his 4-part novel, Joseph and His Brothers. But Szalit's illustrations appeared in a journal called Die Aufklärung, The Enlightenment, in 1929. This journal was co-edited by the sexologist Magnus Hirschfeld, who advocated for sex reform and did research at his Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin. Of course, the story of Dina, Thomas Mann's story, is based on the biblical story of Genesis in Genesis 34. The young Dina goes out to see the daughters of the land, catches the eye of the local prince. Her brothers conclude that she's been raped and retaliate. Szalit's Dina appears proud, desirable, and demure as she peeks out from behind a transparent veil. In the image on the right, the rape of Dina shows Dina being lifted up against her will by 2 soldiers. This is more of an image of abduction than of sexual violation. We could compare it with a famous painting, for example, like Rubens's Rape of the Sabine Women, which is also a scene of abduction. These images tell Dina's story. I just wanted to show one more image from the Dina collection. This one shows a wild dance scene at the Autumn Harvest Festival. Szalit emphasizes the sexual primal aspects of the local Shechemite culture. This scene would also perhaps have been plausible in Berlin. The women's outfits, by my reading anyway, are part Josephine Baker's banana skirt and part ancient Egypt. So in 1927, Rahel Szalit started engaging with and participating in events and exhibiting with the organization called the Verein der Künstlerinnen zu Berlin, the Association of Women Artists in Berlin. This is a group that's still very active today, a really exciting group of women artists. Back in 1929, they organized an exhibition called The Woman of Today, which was meant to showcase the talents of women artists. And there were 65 different artists participating in this exhibition, which mainly showed portraits of women by women. This was in response to other exhibitions that had shown portraits of women done primarily by men. They wanted to give women a chance to show portraits of women by women. And there were 6 paintings in this exhibition that won a prize of 100 marks, including Szalit's Emigrant Woman as Barmaid, Emigrantin as Bardame, which you see here. This image, I think, is really fantastic. It conjures up some familiar scenes that we're familiar with from other art. Think of something like Manet's A Bar at the Foyer Bergère, a barmaid who faces the viewer. But Szalit, again, is sort of rewriting this story. She's showing us a stylish modern woman serving cocktails and pub fare. This painting made quite a splash. Several reviews talked about the fate that emerged from it. And what was really interesting was that people even read it as a Russian emigrant woman as barmaid. They added the word Russian to the title, which was not in the original title. But what this image most definitely is an image of an emigrant, someone who has left a place of origin, but is still in transit and still must work, someone who's working for a living and remains characterized by her emigrant identity. So this painting was part of the larger exhibition Die Frau von heute, the woman of today. And here you can see some of the other paintings that appeared in this exhibition, including a painting of Szalit's friend, the writer Eleonore Kalkowska by Käthe Munzer-Neumann. Kalkowska was a close friend of Szalit's and also had a connection to queer scenes in Berlin. And from their correspondence, we know that Szalit had relationships with both men and women. We talked a little earlier about how Szalit was an active fencer. Not only was she an active fencer, but she was also writing about fencing and illustrating her own article for a Bauhaus magazine called Die Neue Linie. from 1930. So here she's pitching fencing as a sport that has fashionable attire and chivalrous virtues to classy women readers. And we also see another image that appeared in a magazine called Die Dame from this period, where Szalit depicts herself in a sleek self-portrait as a fencer. We see Szalit wearing a high-necked white fencing uniform with a black glove and épée in her left hand. Either she was left-handed or she was looking into a mirror when she created the image. She steadily looks out to meet the viewer's gaze with an unsmiling expression. And my reading of this image is that Szalit is offering an intervention into the genre of the woman as artist self-portrait, where we usually see a woman holding a palette or a paintbrush, standing in front of an easel. Szalit's painting herself here not as an artist, but as an athlete, someone who's ready to rise and engage her opponent, ready to prove herself. Unfortunately, her time in Germany was cut short. And we know that just a few years after she was publishing and illustrating these works, she was forced to go into exile after the Nazis took power, or she chose to go into exile, given the writing on the wall. Her studio that she lived in Paris by the middle of the 1930s is shown in the center here. And the image you see on the right is her last known address in Paris. And both of these were located just on the edge of Montparnasse. Szalit was in very good company. She left Germany in 1933 when the Nazis took power, along with 25,000 other people, including about 20,000 Jews who didn't see Germany as a place that could be home to them any longer. And there were about 200 visual artists in this group that left Germany around this time as well. So she was one of many looking for other places and opportunities to continue to engage freely in the work that she wanted to do. In Paris, she frequented the Café Le Dôme and found new circles of refugees, artists, and fencers. And she joined many artists of the School of Paris who converged in Montparnasse. Many of them were born in the Russian Empire like her, like Chagall, Soutine, Jacques Lipchitz, Manet Katz. Initially, she experienced hard times in Paris. She wrote in 1934, "I have a studio full of paintings, but no one to buy them." But by 1935, things started to look up for her a little bit. She managed to have a solo exhibition at the Galerie Zborowski in 1935. And she joined the Free Artists League, the Freier Künstlerbund, in 1938, which I read as sort of an act of resistance, since this group was organizing itself in response to the Nazi exhibitions of degenerate art being shown in Germany at this time. And this was a group largely consisting of German-speaking artists. So we know that Szalit was again sort of operating in these émigré circles in Paris. In 1939, she exhibited in an exhibition of Jewish art in Paris, and this is her last known participation in a major exhibition. And in this exhibition, she was showing her work alongside work by Marc Chagall, Eugen Spiro, Issachar Beribak, Manet Katz, Chana Orloff, and other Jewish artists. And this exhibition was organized by the art historian Rahel Szalit, who she knew back from her time in Berlin in the 1920s. The proceeds of this exhibition went to the Jewish National Fund. And the exhibition opened with a concert, and the concert included Yiddish, Hebrew, and Ladino songs, and it was followed by dancing. And it really affirms that Paris was home to a flourishing international Jewish art scene on the eve of World War II. Szalit continued to draw and paint during her time in Paris, and here you see a couple images that we can assume are from this period. They appeared in a French newspaper in 1935, and the image, they show a Havdalah scene and a Talmud lesson. These images they're sketches with thicker lines than what she was doing about a decade earlier in her earlier lithographs. She's borrowing the composition of her earlier works, however, and just sort of updating it with a new style. And one of the ways we might read it is that her images look a little less stereotypically East European in these particular renderings. So rather than conclude with the tragic end of Rahel Szalit's life, including her arrest in the Valdiv roundup in July 1942 and her deportation to Auschwitz, I didn't want to conclude with that today. I wanted to conclude instead with some paintings that have been found or that we still have that are not lost. Some of these paintings several paintings have resurfaced in the past few years at auction houses, primarily in France, suggesting that there might be even more work out there that wasn't destroyed. So you too can help keep Rahel Szalit's memory alive. Perhaps keep an eye out for lost paintings that you might encounter. And I wanted to thank you so much for your attention today. And if you'd like to learn more, I hope you'll consider reading the book that's coming out next week. And I'm excited to answer your questions and chat with you more in the Q&A discussion right now. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kerry. We already have the questions started coming in as you were speaking, and so they're first of all, there were questions about the birth date, which you answered, and somebody is saying all of my great-grandparents were from the same area, Poland, Russia, and so on. And in my research of my family tree, I ran into the same issue of multiple birthdays, years also varying from 1880s to 1890s. And I assumed that it was due to miscommunication between languages across borders. So do you have a feeling for the reasons why that happened, or was that just creativity of the pass holders or passport holders, or what do you think?
Yeah, my sense is that there were a lot of different reasons that people were modifying or changing birth dates. And I think some of it is also related to gender. So women's, the birth dates of little girls were not always recorded in the 19th century in Eastern Europe, partly because it was considered something that could be used to sort of trick the evil eye. If the birth date wasn't recorded, it was possible to sort of evade superstition in order to not fall on hard times. Boys' birth dates were recorded more so that they could later then know when their bar mitzvah was, and sort of people kept better track of boys' ages. So in some cases, like Szalit, I actually think that she thought her birth date was several years later than it was. I think she wasn't really sure how old she was. I think she was, she thought she was born in 1892 is my best guess. When she writes her birth date in other years as being even later than 1892, then I think she's sort of making herself a little younger, giving herself a little bit of extra time. And that was also common practice in not just among East Europeans, but also in Central Europe. Plenty of artists and writers, women especially, changed their birth dates to make themselves seem a little bit younger later on in their lives. But again, I do think that, and somebody else asked the question, I can see that about the record being in Russian and Hebrew. You know, it's a really interesting question, and the record does sort of, again, it uses Hebrew words like daughter of, and it's using the Hebrew, not the Yiddish, but it's using the Yiddish place names for the locations in Eastern Europe. So it's sort of a blend of Yiddish and Hebrew on the one side and Russian on the other for the community's record keeping purposes. But it is, I've thought a lot about the birth date and engaged a lot with this question of, you know, not only what year was she born, but also what day. The day of her birth is listed as several different days in many different locations. I think it has to do with calendars and miscalculations. But in any case, I do a longer description of it in the book. You can read all about it.
Oh, okay. So, and then, you know, quite some people want to know which artist she was affiliated in which place. So Eva is asking whether you heard of Rosi Lilienfeld in connection with her, who was also an expressionist illustrator and published the illustration to the Legend of Baal Shem.
Yes, and I'm familiar with Rosi Lilienfeld largely through the research that's being done out of the Frankfurt Jewish Museum. So thank you so much for this question. And I have seen some original books that Rosi Lilienfeld illustrated also. But I don't think that Szalit knew her. I have no evidence that she knew her personally, or had any direct connections to Lilienfeld at this time. And Lilienfeld, I think, was a little bit younger and didn't get the kind of acclaim or attention, as far as I can tell, certainly not in Berlin Jewish circles. May have to do also with geography, location. But I think she was also doing some of her major works into the 1930s, whereas the period that I've been looking at was primarily before 33. So Lilienfeld is not one that I've come across in looking at who Szalit knew and was in contact with. Someone asked me to repeat the names of the artists I mentioned earlier, and I'll say that Jakob Steinhardt is someone who I compare her with at length in the book, partly because I know that she visited his home, that she drew an image in his guest book. I reproduced that in the book as well. He did a portrait of her. They had sort of an artistic exchange and friendship that's documented, that we still have evidence of. And I know that she knew Ludwig Meidner as well. He mentions her a couple times in writings that he did that we have. So there was she was sort of in or adjacent to these circles of Jewish artists who were working in an expressionist style in Berlin in the early 1920s. The question of how many she knew and everyone that she knew, these are questions that we can't fully answer. We do know that she knew the painter Karl Hofer, Hofer, and that she sort of considered herself to be someone in his circle by the late 1920s. So that's another artist that's worth sort of considering her with respect to. And we also know, because she was involved in this organization of women's artists, that she was operating sort of alongside or in tandem with many of the women who were involved in that group. So we know, for example, and I also see some questions here about Käthe Kollwitz. We know that certainly we can guess that she held up Kollwitz as a role model for her own work, because Kollwitz was so prominent and well-known already in the early 1920s, and there weren't that many women producing lithographs. So we can guess that Szalit was familiar with Kollwitz's work and taking a cue from it. But Kollwitz was also exhibiting along with the women of the Association of Women Artists in the late 1920s. And we can guess that Szalit encountered her and all those who were sort of considered to be in circles around Kollwitz at that time, and was being compared with her as well. What's very interesting that I found evidence of is Kollwitz, actually, who was a not Jewish artist, sat on a committee organized by the Jewish community in Berlin, I believe it was late 1930, to give a prize to sort of up-and-coming artists. And Szalit received one of these prizes. So Kollwitz sat on the sort of jury commission to give the prizes, and Szalit received a prize. So there we have evidence that Kollwitz also knew Szalit, not just Szalit knew Kollwitz and upheld her as a role model. So we could even suggest that Kollwitz was supporting Szalit's work in a way, even though we don't have correspondence between the two to support that further. But Szalit did know Julie Wolftorn. She mentions Wolftorn in one of her letters. And she corresponded with the artist, with the art historian Hans Hildebrandt, whose wife Lily Hildebrandt she also corresponded with. And so there's some artist names being thrown around in those letters where we can see sort of which other artists from Eastern Europe Szalit knew, but it wasn't clear in those letters how well she knew those artists, and whether she was close friends with them or inspired by them, simply that she knew them and knew they were out there operating in the world. So we can do best to contextualize Szalit in sort of the two different circles. Early on in the 1920s, Steinhardt, Meidner, we can put Karl Hofer somewhere in the middle there. And then by the end of the 1920s, she's engaging with women artists more. One artist that I compare her with in the book, and that with whom everyone is familiar, is Marc Chagall. And so this is someone who I've thought a lot about in terms of, did Szalit know him? Did he know her? To what extent might their work have mutually influenced each other? I did find evidence that Chagall and Szalit both attended a party at Ludwig Meidner's house in 1923, so they were in the same place at the same time. I would venture probably multiple times, and must have known each other, must have been engaging with each other. Probably Szalit knowing more about Chagall than he knew about her, is a safe guess. But she's certainly in that same milieu of someone who's come from Eastern Europe and is creating images of her Eastern background for a sort of Western consumer, Western audience.
Yeah. Yeah, and it sounds like that's how she started out in Berlin, that she was more attached to her landsmen and her roots, and then she kind of widened her circles. That's what I'm hearing. I don't know.
Sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. So Dennis is asking whether you know whether Szalit attended the Damenklasse, women's class of the Women Artists Association during her time in Munich, because that was, I mean, we have to really remember this was just the start of women being allowed to get education, higher education, whether it would be the arts or any other education. It was really just the beginning.
So this is a great question because several sources suggest that she did attend the Damen Academy or participated in art academies and training in Munich. I don't know if I've actually explored the records that Dennis is mentioning in particular, but I have gone into the records of the Damen Academy, the matriculation records, and Szalit's not listed there. So this means this suggests one of two things. One, she was either saying she studied there in order to sort of gain the prestige and acknowledgement and recognition that she would get as a trained artist who had studied in that particular academy that many other women artists had studied in, or two, maybe she did study there and she wasn't officially enrolled. And that's sort of the trick with Szalit. She didn't have much money. Some of the organizations and academies were charging very steep enrollment fees. So, and she didn't come from the sort of middle-class background that someone like Kolovitz came from. She didn't have the means. She didn't have anyone supporting her necessarily. She had a much more sort of working class framework for starting out. So my guess is that if she received training from any group or any organization in Munich, Paris, London, beyond, all of it was really sort of informal and off the books. And she was using those cities as a way of authenticating herself as an artist, saying that she was trained in Paris partly, and giving herself that sort of extra edge and flavor once she was back in Germany. But we don't have any evidence that she ever officially enrolled or matriculated anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what galleries in Berlin did she exhibit? Did she meet Herwolf Walden and the artist Else Lasker-Schuler? Very concrete question.
Yeah, no, I write a little bit about this, and I'm familiar with Der Sturm and Walden and Lasker-Schuler. She wasn't prominent enough at the time, especially when Walden's gallery was sort of at its peak. She wasn't exhibiting there. And she also, as far as I can tell, never exhibited in Flechtheim's galleries, for example. She got her foot in the door, as Rachel suggested, much more sort of in her Jewish circles in the beginning. She was exhibiting in like the B'nai B'rith Lodge in an exhibition designed to support artists who were having a rough time during those hard times in the early 1920s. She did exhibit with the Berlin Secession, so she had some exhibitions. She participated in some exhibitions that were bigger and bigger name exhibitions in Berlin. Oftentimes after 1927, she was going in as part of a group of women artists exhibiting through the Association of Women Artists in larger Berlin exhibitions. But she wasn't quite as well known as other artists in mainstream circles. She was better known in Jewish circles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So a lot of questions are here about how you found her works, like whether you had any exciting discoveries or where you didn't expect them, where you did your amazing archival work. Like what was your project? You already said 15 years. That's a really long time to do your research. So
Yeah,
yeah.
the reason this story is an interesting story to write and to tell is because I didn't start with a memoir or a diary or some kind of project, the sources that people would usually use when beginning a project to think about how to write a biography, and how to tell someone's life story. Those sources weren't here in my case. They aren't here in Szalit's case. We don't have large files of documents and papers that she left behind. We don't have stacks and stacks of painting and original artworks. So it's much more a process of reconstructing the story from the materials that are out there in the world and sort of hunting them down, finding them. I am sure I have not found all of them, but I have done what I can to find a significant amount that was out there. There isn't much at museums. There's a sort of an odd print or some illustrated books are located in museum collections. So it's not nothing, but it's not as if, you know, every art museum in Germany has a painting by her or something. In fact, I have found very few. What we do have is lithographic prints and illustrated books held by many different museum collections, or at least several different museum collections. And there are only a couple of archives that even have a file called Rahel Szalit if you want to go do this archival work and read more. One is the Akademie der Künste in Berlin, which is now home to the collections of the Association of Berlin Women Artists. So you can go back and look through those records from the 1920s of that organization and find Szalit mentioned in those records. The Jewish Museum in Paris has a small file on Rahel Szalit, no original correspondence, but a little bit of sort of original documentation, some exhibition catalogs, that kind of thing. So the work that I'm doing is primarily rooted in primary sources and finding them, tracking them down. Some of it started with research about newspapers and periodicals, and that was a great place to start in this case because she contributed so much to newspapers and periodicals in the 1920s. And then, of course, the illustrated books provide us with so much of her art and help us tell that story as well. Finding some of the other sources, the Dina illustrations were a really big find. I knew that she had had at least one illustration in Die Aufklärung because I found it mentioned somewhere else, and so I went to the Magnus Hirschfeld Stiftung and said, can you look into this journal? Can you look and see? This was during the pandemic when I couldn't go to the archive myself, right? I said, but can you look and can you see and scan me anything you find by Rahel Szalit? And indeed, there was a whole set of amazing illustrations that no one had really looked at for 90 years, just sort of sitting there in the archive. So it's really exciting to find and bring to light some of those images and really also put them out there. The Thomas Mann illustrations Szalit never mentioned when she was telling her own biography, even after they'd appeared in print. So we can ask questions as to why that was. Were they too risque? Were they too far out there? Perhaps different from her other work? Didn't sort of fit the trajectory she was trying to create for herself.
Yeah. Yeah, so you talk about her writing about herself, like a kind of an autobiography or something. Where did you find that, and which language does she write in, or does it change over time?
Sure, yeah, she didn't write a proper autobiography. She just wrote a few short autobiographical texts, like articles. And one of the best ones appeared in the magazine or newsletter of the Jüdischer Frauenbund, the Jewish Women's Association. And that was just a couple pages long in 1930. So she does sort of create and tell a narrative there about her own story. She also tells her own story when she's corresponding with various people at certain times. So you see sort of a paragraph that she wrote. That was all in German. Her primary language, that as far as I can tell, the primary language she was operating in after she moved to Germany is German. But we know she also knew Polish and had plenty of friends who spoke Polish, and that she could speak and write Polish, but not as well as German. She says it in one of her letters that she wrote in Polish that I got access to. She she talks about how her Polish isn't as strong as her German. So my guess is that Yiddish was her first language, German was her second language in terms of proficiency level, not necessarily order in which she learned it. And Polish and French are somewhere in the third and fourth range. And I don't know how good her French was, but I knew she knew enough French to get by.
Sounds like she was gifted with languages. So, so with all these this engagement with there's a question about that with women. Did you kind of hinted at it that she was bisexual, or was she like what? I mean, she was married, right? She had relationships, and yeah.
So the best I can do is that probably she wouldn't necessarily have used the term bisexual. It might be a little bit anachronistic to project that onto her, but she was part of this broader culture of people who sort of saw gender and sexuality as a little more fluid in this period, and didn't think too hard about it. She certainly was participating in a more conventional, or what seems, at least on the surface, to be a conventional relationship when she got married. But the circumstances of her marriage also raise lots of questions. And these are things we really can never know. We don't have any correspondence. There are no records. How are we going to find the sort of smoking gun that tells us what the nature of her marriage was at this point, right? But maybe it was for citizenship, for a passport. Maybe it was for companionship. Maybe it was for love. Who knows? The narratives have been crafted and created and codified, but are they true? We can ask those questions. But we do know from some of her personal correspondence with a friend that she was engaging in both relationships with men and women when she was living in Paris in the 1930s. And that suggests that she had what we might call a bisexual identity today, and sort of engaging in those emigre artist circles, again, from a perspective of a sort of a free love approach.
Yeah, which was very common.
It was very common
at that time. So not as kind of featured as today, but it was just a lot of, especially creative artist circles, were in each other's life a lot, in people's life. So very different question. Can you give us an idea of this, the dimensions of her paintings?
Only the last paintings that I showed do I have dimensions for, partly because many of her paintings were lost. To repeat again, so if it was recorded somewhere, maybe we have dimensions for it, but if it wasn't, we don't. But the one is 56 by 50 centimeters and the other 51 by 64. So the smaller ones, at least, would fit into a suitcase. If you're thinking about the town musicians, I think would fit into a suitcase, and was something that she did likely transport from Germany to France, for example, when she emigrated. Some of the bigger ones would be harder to fit into a suitcase. And I think if we're talking about work that she did in France that might still resurface at auction houses, some of those could be on larger canvases. I will say there's one description of a work that I found that I've not seen any images of, and those were larger murals that she did with the Association for Women Artists in 1927, and they sound unbelievably amazing, but we don't have any images of them. And I can't even imagine that they were preserved, right? If she's sort of like painting on a wall for an event, maybe there's a photograph of it somewhere. That would be, I think, the best we could hope for in that instance. But so a vast scale is the answer to that question, from small to large. Yes.
Yeah. Wow. So were there, do you know of any paintings that were in museum collections when the Nazis came to power and that were removed as degenerate?
Nothing that I've been able to track down, nothing specific, no records indicate this. I do believe that she had work that was in the museum of the Berlin Jewish Museum's collection when it opened in 1933. She had already had artwork included in the Berlin Jewish Communities collection even before 33. And I know that some of that work also then made its way with other works that were mysteriously sort of confiscated and transported to Warsaw. So some of her original prints from the Berlin Jewish collection have ended up in Warsaw now. I don't know, and at least among them was probably at least that little watercolor painting that I showed, The Drive to the Wedding. So that's a painting. But in general, more of them were prints or drawings. Fewer large paintings, and I don't have any evidence about Nazi confiscation. Haven't been able to find that.
Yeah. So what do you consider to be her greatest contribution to the field of art? Or is she significant because she is a Jewish woman artist? Yeah.
It's a wonderful question, and thank you for asking me to sort of again clarify and distill my conclusions. I think that when we study Jewish art, especially from the early 20th century, especially in Europe, we hardly find mention of any women artists. Not that there weren't Jewish women artists, but that they weren't necessarily making enough art with Jewish subjects that they were included in the sort of Jewish art club. Oftentimes Jewish art is talking about synagogue architecture or decoration. It's much more ornamental. And women artists are simply not part of that story. So I think Rahel Szalit's contribution was that she was part of the story. She did even manage to get her name into some works that were sort of art histories of Jewish art at the time. And she made a contribution that was recognized during her lifetime. She was acknowledged and seen and visible as a prominent Jewish artist in the Jewish community in Germany. And I think that's a big deal. And I think somehow that's kind of gone missing and not part of the story that's always being told about Jewish art from this period, where we hear about Chagall, we hear about Steinhardt, we hear about Meidner. And thanks to the work of some of our wonderful colleagues, we're starting to hear about more Jewish women artists. And I hope Szalit can be part of that story that's being told. And also, being widely known. And I hope that this talk will help people sort of direct their attention to something that had perhaps they had missed before. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It definitely did, and you definitely put her back on the map and hopefully into art history as well. And now we just all have to read your book, because it feels that we just touched the tip of the iceberg in this 1 hour, and that you have so much more to say about Rahel Szalit. So thank you so much, Kerry. And
thank you. And yes, the book is being published officially next week, so March 12th. So please do look into it if you're interested.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, Kerry.
Take
good care, everyone. Thank you.